Before we get started with this episode of Poll Hub, we just want to let you know that Poll Hub will be here live on election night. We're going to be doing a live video podcast starting at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time, where we'll look at the final polls and the first results, which will be coming in right then. And we're going to be taking your questions. Then what we'd like to ask you to do is make us your second screen for the night. We're going to be on our Facebook page and on Twitter taking and answering your questions while you're watching the results come in. We will be too. We'll be able to have a conversation about it. Now, on with the show. This time on Poll Hub, 2 new swing state polls with our partners at NBC News. As we near the end of this seemingly endless campaign, we're going to break down the numbers. There's a lot of interesting stuff here. Then Ron Brownstein is here to talk about all things election 2020, what he's looking for on election night, the races he's looking to, the states, the counties. He digs deep, and we're going to dig deep with him. Clock's ticking, so let's get to it. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm Jay DeDapper, Director of Innovation here at the Marist Poll.
And I'm Barbara Carvalho, Director of the Marist Poll.
And I'm Lee Miringoff, Director of the Marist College Institute for Public Opinion.
We have virtually nothing to do, so we've been popping bonbons and getting some nice massage treatment. No, that's not true. We've been polling like mad, and we're still polling like mad. 2 new polls, swing state polls, critical states that everybody's been looking at, Florida and North Carolina. And we have new results on both of them with our partners at NBC News. Among likely voters, we've got Biden up by 4 in Florida and by 6 in North Carolina. What does it mean?
Well, I would say that these are states that, first of all, we're going to know something about on election night. These are states that count the votes, the early vote, early. So we're actually going to have an indication from these 2 states as to what the narrative is of the evening. And look, Donald Trump carried both of these last time. He can carry them again and still find a narrow pathway to winning. If Joe Biden is running up the score in either Florida or North Carolina, although we won't probably know officially that it's 270 on November 3rd, but if Florida is declared for him or North Carolina, that's probably, for all intents and purposes, game over.
I think one of the things that's really interesting that we're seeing in many of these states is very often we see this in presidential election years where you have this, you have a national election. And I don't mean it's just because it's, the presidency, but in other words, the issues get nationalized. Everybody's kind of assessing the campaign in a similar manner, whether you're for one candidate or the other. And so in that case, we generally see a very similar coalition of voters in each individual state. And then depending upon the proportion of those voters that exist in that state, we can almost predict then, what the margin in the kind of the latest polls are going to be. And the reason why I mention that is because the 2 polls that we just released, Florida and North Carolina, we're seeing those very similar patterns. Biden, being strong, not surprisingly, among Black voters and those who plan to vote by mail or absentee, some also in person, but particularly among voters with a college degree, especially white women with a college degree, voters under the age of 45. And surprisingly, this time around, those people who are age 65 or older. So
especially in Florida.
We're seeing it in Florida and also, in North Carolina. Trump still has I think a point or 2, a lead among that group in North Carolina, but that is a huge turnaround from what he had done 4 years ago against Hillary Clinton, when I believe he won that group by 23 points. So the other group that's been key here are independents. And again, these are all areas where Biden has made inroads, but we see the consistency as we go from state to state. And I think what's very unusual in 2016, we actually saw a different pattern. We saw a Clinton lead both nationally and in the states getting smaller and smaller. We saw some issues with her support in the Midwest. And this last week, and obviously we still have a solid weekend of campaigning to go. But this time we're seeing very similar patterns from state to state, and Biden making inroads in areas and getting support among groups that Trump outpaced Clinton significantly last time.
I think.
Yeah, and I just think.
Yeah, go ahead, Lee.
No, I was just going to say, and from a polling standpoint, which is always what we'd like to talk about, I mean, one of the things we're asking people in these surveys, because so many people have already voted, we're actually asking them who they voted for, which is a little different than just saying, well, if the election were held today, who would you vote for? And we're seeing a slightly greater refusal on that question, which is to be expected. We're seeing in some other polls a much higher refusal, which may have to do with quality of interviewing. I'm not sure what the issue is there, but that's something just to watch for. And when we do the postmortems on the polls and their accuracy.
And we'll get to the postmortem soon enough. Election day is right around the corner. I would just point out one last thing on these polls and what we've seen nationally. Big difference from 2016, and that is the unsure and undecideds. They were in double digits in some cases, in some polls at this time, 3 or 4 days before the election in 2016. And it's hard to find them now. They're out there, but they're in the low single digits. So this is a very different year from 2016, maybe different in other ways. You know, that we may be surprised in other ways, but certainly this is not a replay of 2016. And I think we're going to learn on election night just how different America is in 2020 than it was in 2016.
We're very happy to continue the conversation right now with our friend Ron Brownstein, Senior Political Analyst for CNN and Senior Editor at The Atlantic. And there's nothing senior about anything in his thinking, for sure, because I find Ron to be very original in the way he looks at data.
Thank you. Well, as you guys do as well. I'm really happy to be with you. You know, I've been a great admirer of your work, and you guys have been so helpful over the years. So it's really an honor and a privilege to join you.
Okay, great. I appreciate that. Let's start out with what's historic right now. Turnout is historic. Not just the early vote. It just looks like we're going to have a major participation this time. Do you anticipate this is going to be differentially significant, or do you think the water is rising and will lift all boats somewhat evenly?
I think the water is rising and will lift all boats somewhat evenly, and that really complicates the path for Trump. First of all, it's really importantly why we are seeing such big turnout. It is because Americans correctly understand this as a hinge point in our history. And, you know, in many ways, when Trump, you know, the entire Trump presidency could have been encapsulated in that last word of his slogan, "Make America Great Again." It has been a program of restoration, political restoration, policy restoration. I mean, he has governed as the president of Red America rather than trying to court Blue America. He has kind of demonized it as a foil, the big metros, the big cities, to try to energize and mobilize his non-urban base. And in many ways, you know, as young people have said to me, so many things that they thought were settled in the country about racial equity or gay rights or transgender rights or climate have been reopened. And I think what you are seeing now is kind of a battle of the bulge moment between what America has been, which, you know, is kind of Trump country, reflects the America of the mid 20th century with all its strengths and limitations. And the Democratic coalition represents the kind of the America of the emerging America of the 21st century, the big, diverse information age, more secular, more white collar metros. And both sides are turning out in big numbers. Trump's problem is that in the end, Biden is consolidating the emerging America more than Trump is his America. And as your polling and others have shown, it's not like Trump's coalition is falling apart, but there are slight fractures that we'll talk about in a minute that are weakening him precisely as the margins are going to be astronomical among young people, college-educated whites, and the big metro centers. So it's kind of an asymmetrical shift from 2016.
Wow. And you've talked about this, Trump trying, to paraphrase you here, to squeeze out greater margins out of a shrinking group at the risk of offending the larger group that's growing.
Yes.
And if there's one sentence, I don't know if that was two sentences or not, but if there's something that captures what's going on, I thought that nailed it.
No, I think my one sentence description of his strategy and the strategy he sends his party to is squeezing bigger margins out of shrinking groups at the expense of provoking greater opposition from the groups that are growing. I mean, you can look at that in a lot of different ways. I mean, this election is a generational hinge point. The baby boom has been the largest generation in the electorate since roughly 1980, when they surpassed the GI generation. 40 years of uninterrupted dominance. Now, for the first time, millennials and Gen Z will equal the boomers as a share of eligible voters. They don't vote as much, so they won't equal them as actual voters, but that's coming. By 2024, they will equal them as a share of actual voters, according to the States of Change projections. And by 2028, they'll be way past them. Trump is strong with the baby boom. He's strong with older white voters, although not quite as strong as 2016. But among these younger generations, I mean, he has sentenced the Republican Party, or he has dug them an enormously deep hole. I mean, look at your numbers in your national and your state polling. He is looking at Joe Biden, who is not exactly a big inspiring figure for those voters, is nonetheless going to significantly exceed Clinton in 16, who only got about 55% of them. He's probably, I think now likely going to exceed Obama in 12, who got 60. And he's going to threaten Obama's 66 from 2008. And these are the growing groups in the electorate. Same thing on, race. Obviously, the non-white share of the vote increases 1-2 points every year, more in the Sun Belt, less in the Rust Belt. College whites are drifting up a little every 4 years, and non-college whites are dropping, who are Trump's core group, 2 points every 4 years as a share of eligible voters. Even with all of the appeal that Trump has, he has to turn out more of them just to stay in place, because they are a smaller share of the vote almost everywhere, including all of the Rust Belt states. I mean, even in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Minnesota, non-college whites are a smaller share of eligible voters today than they were in 2016. So, and evangelical Christians shrinking as a share of the vote, while seculars rise as a share of the vote. In every front, Trump is trying to squeeze bigger margins from shrinking groups. And I always ask whenever I talk to groups, I say, how many businesses in the world would adopt that strategy? Trying to dominate the markets that are shrinking at the expense of writing off the markets that are growing. But that is what the Republican Party, with astonishingly little dissent, astonishingly little discussion, has basically bought into. And you're going to see it in the House, you're going to see it in the Senate, and you're certainly going to see it at the presidential level. Now, there's still a lot of people in those shrinking markets, and they may be able to squeeze out some victories in the Electoral College. The Senate obviously benefits them because their constituencies are overrepresented in the small states. But as a long-term proposition, no one would buy into that.
One thing that comes up in our swing state polls, and you just talked about it, is the share of the vote that is looking to go to Joe Biden that is younger. But historically, younger voters have become slightly, if not significantly, in some generations, more conservative as they get older. I mean, we look at this we look at polls as a snapshot in time. And I'm kind of looking past this election to, does this new coalition really hold together as a coalition? Is this really some kind of doomsday scenario for Republicans, as some have suggested, or is it a snapshot in time?
Well, first, I think there are two different questions there. Generations, there does seem to be some life cycle effect, but the cohort effect is very powerful too. And the life cycle effect of becoming potentially somewhat more conservative as you age and buy houses and have kids and pay taxes, all of that is off of the original baseline. I mean, it's not like you start from scratch. And if Republicans are losing literally 2/3 of the group that is going to be the largest block in the electorate, like a good life cycle effect would take that down to losing 3/5. Right? I mean, it's not going to take you to 50-50 if you're starting at 2-1 against. I don't think there's any, you got political scientists in your neighborhood, but I don't think there's anyone who would say the life cycle effect is going to move a generation 20 points. It'll move it somewhat, but if you're starting at 2-1, you're starting in a pretty big hole. And that's where Trump has sentenced them. And, someone said to me the other day, Trump's imprint on the GOP in the eyes of younger generations is a tattoo, not a sticker. That, he is defined as someone who is hostile to basically every cause they have embraced. I mean, kind of gay rights, racial equity, climate change. I mean, he is defining the Republican Party, I believe, as a party fundamentally hostile to the way the country is changing. That is his core message to his audience. I am the human wall against all of the change. These mobs are coming to get you in the suburbs. And so I think that is very ominous for Republicans. I think the fact that if you think about their coalition, they are about 2/3 of Republicans are white Christians, and I think about 2/3 now are non-college whites. Those groups were that share of the overall country in the late 1990s. Okay, so like I often say that we're not only dealing with parties that have different visions of America, we're dealing with parties that now offer different versions of America. And as long as the Republicans are so invested in catering to the priorities and the resentments under Trump, the resentments kind of move up on this ladder of groups that are shrinking and are alienating the groups that are growing. It's not a doomsday scenario because the Electoral College gives them an advantage. The Senate structure, 2 senators per state. There are a lot of states that are completely untouched by these changes. But if you kind of look at what's happening, the places that have been kind of anomalous for Republicans in some ways are the places that are part of the changing America, but have still been Republican. And that's like North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, Texas, South Carolina. And I think in this election, you're going to see that, yeah, there may be enough rural votes to hold Georgia, and there may be enough rural votes to hold Texas. But Jay, he could lose the metros in Texas, Trump, by 1 million votes. Okay, that's where 70% of the jobs are in the state, 70% of the economic output. If you're losing the metros by 1 million votes, and you're counting on Nacogdoches and Odessa to save you, eventually you run out of people. And the same thing is true in Georgia. I mean, what Hillary Clinton won? Okay, Obama lost Cobb and Gwinnett outside of Atlanta by 60,000 votes. Hillary Clinton won them by 26. Stacey Abrams won them by 75. What's Biden going to win them by? You tell me. 100, 125? So,
well, and there's been in-migration. Georgia's a bigger state, and the people who've in-migrated are not from the South.
The Sun Belt suburbs are not the northern suburbs. They're not going to be the suburbs of Colorado or Northern Virginia. More people are conservative, more of them are evangelical Christians. But given the size of the non-white population in these Sun Belt states, if you start getting into the mid-40s among college whites or above in these states, which they have not been able to do, they haven't been able, except for North Carolina, they haven't been able to get above 40. That's where Stacey Abrams topped out. Beto hit the low 40s. If you start getting 45, 46, 47, 48% of college whites in states like Texas and Georgia, 40% of the voters in those states are non-white. So that's probably plenty to win. Again, the rural parts of these states are not growing. It's the metros that are growing, and the metros are where Trump has defined the party. Cities are dangerous, dirty and dangerous. They're being run by crazy mayors, and that's why they have COVID. I just think that the Republican Party has to choose whether it's going to try to continue to run against the emerging America or try to persuade the emerging America.
One of the things that we've seen this time in the polling, which does seem to be a bit of an anomaly, at least from 2016 and the number of presidential cycles in the past, is the support that President Trump is getting among Latinos. And not just, I know we're primarily in Florida, but not just Latinos who are older, but also Latinos who are younger. What's your take on that?
Yeah. And I think Barbara thinks something a little bit of that happening in the Black community too. I mean, look, you're going to have an enormous gender gap among Latinos. It'll probably be bigger than among any other group. And you could have a gender gap among African Americans that is bigger than among whites. I mean, there is an audience for Trump's kind of swagger and his kind of, tough guy approach among African American and Hispanic men. I think it's very clear. I mean, and also before the pandemic, those groups were doing better in the economy. I mean, he's had a case to make to them. But the resistance he faces among the women in those groups remains so towering. I mean, 75% in the CNN poll of women of color were voting against him. And among Black women, what's it going to be? I mean, will it be zero on the other side? It could be like 96-0 or something like that. So when you're facing that much resistance among women, yes, I do think he's going to do better with Black and Hispanic men. And it is the one way in which he is kind of doing what Biden is doing with older and blue collar white women, kind of making some encroachment on the other side of this transformation restoration line, as I call it. But the fact that the women are holding out so much against him, I think limits the total size of what he can achieve.
We last year in last election in 2016, our final 3 states that we polled to see if Hillary Clinton was going to widen the playing field were Arizona, Texas, and Georgia.
Oh yeah.
Were we ahead of our time
You were ahead of your time. Lee, how often have you been ahead of your time? You've been ahead of your time since before time. Look, there are two things. Look, the mistake has been among Democrats and other analysts to assume that demographic change alone will tip the state. In fact, if you go back to the 90s and you look at the states that went from red to blue, then, hard to imagine now, California, Illinois, New Jersey. You go to the beginning of this century, Virginia, Colorado, and to some extent, North Carolina. And then you are where we are now with Georgia, Texas, and Arizona, and maybe South Carolina on the same moving walkway. It's two elements that have to be combined. It is an increasing minority share of the vote and the population, but also an improved democratic performance among college-educated whites. Those were the two things that were there in the 90s. Those were the two things that were there for Virginia and Northern and Colorado. We hadn't seen that. We hadn't seen the latter in the Sun Belt. I mean, even as the minority population grew and Democrats imperfectly worked to kind of turn more of it out, they had not seen really any. I think Wendy Davis in 2014 in the Texas governor's race won like 20% of college whites. And the same thing with with Sam Nunn's daughter and Jimmy Carter's grandson. They were like in the low 20s in 2014 among college whites. You see a little movement in 2016. I mean, Hillary gets to, I think, around 30 maybe in Georgia. And then, as I said, Stacey Abrams and Beto get to around 40 or low 40s among them in 2018. And Biden will probably do a little better than that. I don't know how much better than that as again, the Sun Belt suburbs and not the Rust Belt suburbs, but he's going to probably exceed 40% among college whites in Georgia and in Texas. Certainly he's probably going to win a majority of them in Arizona. So it's kind of the maturation of both. And while that's happening, the non-white share of the vote will be 2 or 3, or maybe even 3.5 points higher in all of these states than it was even in 2016. So you've got two things converging and leaving Trump, and the Republican Party increasingly. Trump is exiling the Republican Party from the metro centers that are driving population and economic growth. And he's leaving them more and more dependent on non-college whites, evangelical whites, and rural whites, all of whom on a national basis, and I think even in these states, are declining as a share of the population and the electorate, squeezing bigger margins out of shrinking groups. Could it work again? Sure. Is it a business model that any company in the world would adopt? No.
So, Ron, if indeed the election plays out the way some of the polls suggest, we'll have you back and we'll discuss whether the Democrats can keep together their grand coalition they're building of
hard
parts.
Not easy.
That's the next big question, right?
Yeah, no, it's a bipolar. It's two very divergent polls. You can see it in the House. They dominate. The House is really a good reflection of this, right? Because they dominate inner city urban districts that have large minority populations. Many of whom are below the median income, and they are going to be unbelievably dominant now in white collar suburban districts. Going into 2018, Republicans still controlled 43% of the House seats, where there were more college graduates than average. After 2 years of Trump, that number was down to 24% of the House seats with more college graduates. Democrats have 3/4 of the House seats where there are more college graduates than average. And if you look at what's up in Texas, North Carolina, Indiana, Missouri, for goodness sake, it's possible the Republicans will be down to about 20% of the House seats with more college graduates than average. Biden could win white college graduates. I think he will by the biggest margin ever. Wait, what did you have him at, Barbara? And you had him in the high 50s in your last national poll. No Democrat has ever gotten that high. And you go state after state after state. He is maybe, except for Florida and North Carolina, often has been somewhat close. Georgia, he's slightly behind. But in virtually every state outside of the deep inner Southeast, he's leading among college graduates. I mean, he was leading among college graduates in a Montana poll that came out last week.
So Ron, just one last thought. What are you going to be looking for early on Tuesday night?
Oh, that's a great question. I think if I had to pick one thing, it would be Biden's performance in the mid-sized blue-collar counties of the Rust Belt that flipped to Trump, the Obama-Trump counties, like Luzerne and Erie and Green Bay and whatever Racine is in. Kenosha, I think, is its own county. Youngstown, Toledo. I think the numbers are going to be off the charts in Oakland County and Dane County and Franklin County. Mecklenburg and Wake even, and certainly all the Northern Virginia, Montgomery, Delaware, Bucks outside the white collar counties. I think those numbers are going to be off the charts. And that might be enough to win by itself, even if he doesn't improve in these mid-sized blue collar places. But I think if I am going to be looking at one thing, that'll be it. It'll be like, is Erie looking better? Is Wilkes-Barre looking better? Is Scranton looking better? Racine and Kenosha and Green Bay? And then secondarily, how big do the numbers get in those white collar suburbs, and how far does that extend into the South? For me, like, it's funny. In 2018, I wasn't on the air till CNN until the next morning. I was basically consulting with the Magic Wall team in the holding area. So it was Christmas for me, because like they're, super data guys, but they have no idea what the wall can answer any question, but they have no idea what to ask the wall because they're like data guys. So they kind of enlisted me to come hang out with them for 7 hours, which was, amazing. And so like I could ask them to call up house seats by, suburbia, and at this point, everybody's on the air on all three networks, all three cable networks. Like, well, maybe it's not a blue wave. They didn't. Amy McGrath didn't win, and it was like Abigail Spanberger was winning in the suburbs of Richmond.
Oh,
On the blue wall thing, I could, as we called up, we had created this variable of college plus house seats. So Abigail Spanberger is winning. They're going to win 35 seats. If they're winning Abigail Spanberger's seat, there are an awful lot of places that look like that are less Democratic, less Republican, that they're going to win. So I think the same thing. I mean, I think like if Oakland County, Michigan is a 15-point margin, which is what Whitmer got, instead of a 7-point margin, which was Hillary got, a white collar county. If Dane County moves further up, if Mecklenburg moves further up, if Gwinnett and Cobb moves further up, I think that's really important. But I think the single most important thing is, does Biden regain any of the ground in those blue collar communities? And I would say that is the job he was hired to do. I mean, if you were going to drop a candidate in the lab to flip the Sun Belt and to turn out more younger, non-white voters across the, it would not be Joe Biden. But it might be Joe Biden who you draw up in the lab to win back at least some more of those blue collar white guys that we've been interviewing in diners in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania
for 4 years.
That's job one for Biden. That was his unique selling proposition as a candidate, and that's really his shortest path to 270. 3 states and a cloud of dust, as I like to say.
Yeah, Ron, we certainly now know what you're going to be looking at, and know that we're going to be looking at you as well on Tuesday. So thank you very much for sharing those insights as always.
Oh, thanks for having me, guys. Really a lot of fun.
Oh, that's awesome, Ron. Thank you so very much.
All right, we'll see you on election night. Thanks, Ron.
That will do it for this edition of Poll Hub. Poll Hub is a production of the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York. Mary Griffith is our executive producer. Casey Schaff is our editor. And Amelia Morell, Leo Ruiz, Madeline Jones, and Marcello Bettman are our production assistants.
And we want to just remind you again, set an alert on your phone. Election night starting at 6:30 Eastern time. Poll Hub is going to be live video podcast. We're going to be looking at the final polls. The first results will be coming in as we go live. And most importantly, we're there to take your questions. So you're going to be able to ask us questions and we'll answer them right there live. And then make us your second screen for the night. We know you're going to be watching TV. We are too, and watching the results come in. But we're going to be on our Facebook page and also on Twitter, taking and answering your questions all night long. Well, maybe not all night, but pretty late into the night. So make sure you make a note of that, because we're going to be there for you to answer those questions you have as the results come in. Until then, get out and vote if you already haven't, and stay safe. We'll see you on Tuesday night.